Did I do that right? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so what do I want to talk about today? I want to talk about the Omer, but there are many different dimensions of the Omer. First of all, I'm going to say things that are very simple because I'm not going to assume that everybody knows everything. The Omer was a korban that was brought in the Beit HaMikdash, and it was a korban mincha, and it was brought on the 16th of Nisan, as the Torah calls it, Mimachras HaShabbos, the day after Shabbos. And exactly. And here we have a tremendous debate between the Tukim and the Prushim, but that itself is an hour-long discussion. Yeah. So we're going to focus now on the Prushim. We'll leave out the Tukim. They'll claim that we owe them one. But for us, it's the 16th, the day after Shabbos. We're going to try to understand why the Torah, instead of being more explicit and being clear and call this day after the beginning of Pesach, it used that very ambiguous term that led to this debate. And it called it the day after Pesach. After why is Pesach called Shabbos in this context? Okay, that's not the main point of that discussion, but we'll try to get back to that as well.
I have a question. If it's a korban mincha, why do we own it at Marav time?
I'll tell you what it is. On the page that I gave you, you'll see that the Gemara tells. Oh, you didn't get that page? Okay. Do we have one more copy here? Okay. Yeah. I had no clue where and how to make copies, but I grabbed a couple of copies. You'll see that Tosfos and Megillah points out that there are two main aspects of the Omer. One is what's called Ktsiras HaOmer, and they went out and they cut the barley, they cut the Omer. The other is Havas HaOmer, which means the actual korban. Whereas the korban itself is brought during the day, cutting of the Omer is at night. And the Mishnah tells us in Megillah that we can categorize all mitzvos under two different headings. One is called mitzvahs halayla, it's called mitzvahs hayom. And whenever the Torah tells us that the mitzvah is at night, it means the entire night. From, let's say, Tzeis HaKochavim, when the stars come out, until daybreak in the morning. And Ktsiras Omer, cutting the Omer, is not an exception to that rule. It requires Laila. So at night, we cut the Omer, and Kol HaLaila Kshera Ktsiras Omer. Now, you've all heard of Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam, the grandson of Rashi. Tosfos in Megillah quotes Rabbeinu Tam, and he says that we have to count the Omer at night. And he says if we didn't count the Omer at night, but I'm not going to tell you what tonight's Omer is because it's getting a little late, but let's say we counted 4 last night. If we didn't count it at night, that's it. We've messed up. And apparently Rabbeinu Tam understood that the mitzvah of Sfiras Omer, of counting the Omer, is related to Ktsiras Omer, to cutting the Omer, to the harvesting of the Omer, not to the bringing of the Omer. Now the Rambam paskins that if he didn't count at night, he can count during the day. And the Rambam in Hilchos Tmidim Umusafim writes that since the entire day is appropriate for counting the Omer, we're going to start at the earliest possible moment. Now in Halacha, when is the earliest possible moment of any Yud day? At night. Because Hayom Holech Achar Halayla. So that in the Jewish calendar, the day follows the night. So therefore, the Rambam wants to count the entire day, and therefore you start at night. But the Rambam says if you didn't count at night, count during the day. Apparently, the Rambam is of the opinion that the mitzvah of counting the Omer is not dependent and not limited by Ktsiras HaOmer, but it applies to the entire general michlol that we call the whole mitzvah of Omer, which is comprised of 2 parts: the bringing the harvesting of the Omer and the bringing of the Omer. So therefore, both night and day are included in this mitzvah. Okay, so I say that by way of introduction to answer your question. And again, night, according to Rabbeinu Tam, is critical. Night, according to the Rambam, is only the best time to perform the mitzvah in a perfect way, meaning that you want to get the entire day included in your counting. Like L'mashal, I'll give you an example. My son-in-law the other night it was quite late. It was probably around 11 p.m. at night. And I asked him if he counted the Omer. And he told me he hasn't davened Ma'ariv yet. So he's going, across the street from where we live in Har Nof. We have a minion factory. And you can get a minion there at 1 in the morning for Ma'ariv. No problem. It's called Imre Shefer. So he was going to go to Ma'ariv at a very late hour. But I said to him, Avi is his name, Avi, why are you delaying the counting of the Omer? You should be counting the Omer at the earliest possible time. In fact, there's one school of thought in the poskim who would say we should count the Omer even after Shkia, that means after sunset.
Plag.
Well, Plag would be B'diavad. I don't think anything, as far as I know, there's no shita that would advocate L'chatchila to count it Plag. But there are opinions, and that seems to be the Vilna Gaon, for example, and the minhag of the old Tanya Yerushalmi, to count immediately after Shkia. And don't delay. So even though you're not going to daven Ma'ariv right now, you should be counting the Omer with Shkia, with sunset. Now, from sunset to Seis HaKochavim could be in Israel approximately 20 minutes. I think in Britain it could be as much as 40 minutes. But the idea would be to get we call it a Yiddish chaparine, make sure that you can count the entire day. So therefore you want to count as early as possible. That's why I point out to Av. My son-in-law had a ha'ara. He claimed that maybe I should daven I should count the Omer after Ma'ariv because there's what he called a kiyum tzibur, meaning that we should not count as individuals, but we should rather count as a community, as a tzibur. And therefore, their opinion, it's a very, shall we say, minority dissenting view, but the real opinion is that the Omer does not depend, the counting of the Omer does not depend upon the tzibur. It's what we call a chovas yachid. Every individual is chayav in counting the Omer. And why delay counting the Omer and take the outside chance that you might forget counting the Omer? It's better to count it as early as you can.
The Shkia is the earliest part of the day, you say.
Would be the early time to count the Omer, but that's only according to one opinion. Many other opinions, and that's what we're familiar with in Chutz La'aretz, is wait till after it says.
Of course, in Chutz La'aretz, very rarely do they say that after the Shkia, you're allowed.
That's because
you're allowed to make the bracha because it's the Rabbanan.
Right here in Yerushalayim, in Eretz Yisrael in general, the Vilna Gaon had a tremendous impact. So the minhagim are very much dependent upon they reflect the opinion of the Gaon. So the Vilna Gaon was of the opinion that we should already be counting with Shkia. That's not what we're familiar with in Chutz La'aretz. The same thing, by the way, I don't want to get off on a tangent, applied to B'dikas Chametz. And the Gaon's view was immediately with sunset. We shouldn't wait for the stars to come out. We should be Bodek Chametz. Okay, I don't want to get off on a tangent.
So look, what I doesn't even bring the raw.
That I don't know. But let's not get sidetracked because I want to tell you how we can structure our time. If I'm not mistaken, Benji, we have until what, about 6:30?
6:20, until 6:30.
Till 6:20. Great. So we have until 6:20. So here's what I'd like to do. I want to divide up our time into the following three parts. One part is, could we bring the Omer today? Okay, that's pretty revolutionary. I don't know if anyone here advocates that we should bring the Omer today, but I want to present to you one school of thought that dates back at least 160 years ago and possibly even 8 centuries ago. Okay, so that's one aspect of what I want to talk to you about. And that's why I think we may have titled the Shia tonight, Bring the Omer Today, or something along that. The second part of our discussion tonight will be to try to understand what happens in a case where I skipped a day. Okay, can I continue counting with a bracha, without a bracha? And that's the second. The third dimension is what I call a little bit of hashkafa, a little bit of Jewish philosophy about the Omer in general, and what does it mean to have tmimos, to count the entire Omer, all 49. Okay, then, so those are the three sections. Okay. Now, the issue of whether or not we could bring the Omer, even though we don't have the Beis HaMikdash, is really a reflection of a tremendous debate that began 160 or 170 years ago when a certain Rav, I'll tell you a little bit about him, his name was Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher, and there are cities in Israel that have a street named after him, Rehov Kalisher. He wrote an entire treatise. Now, just to give you a little background, he was a student of two major rabbis. Those who are in the world of halachic thinking will know them immediately by name, recognize them. One is Rabbi Akiva Eiger, and the other is the Nesivos. The Nesivos, Rabbi Yaakov Lisa. He was the Rav in a place called Lisa in Poland. These were his two Rebbeim. So we're not talking about someone who is outside of the Masorah. He's very much part of the tradition of Israel. And he writes a book, and the name of the book is Drishas Sion, right? The Gemara says in a number of places that we should be Doresh Sion, which means that Yeshayahu Hanavi tells us we should think about Sion. Sion is a reference to Yerushalayim, and more specifically, Beis HaMikdash. So that's why he chose the title, because all of his work before Pesach in our time. He does not mention the Omer. My name is Berzon, so Berzon is going to try to take from Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher and extrapolate some sort of conclusion about the Omer. Okay, then that's going to be my little addition.
He was one of the pioneers.
He was the pioneer of a movement called Avat Tzion, and they were pushing for settling in Eretz Yisrael. Now, this work has within it an exchange of letters between him and his Rebbe, Rabbi Akiva Eiger, about whether or not we could bring the Korban Pesach in our time. Does that mean that we could set up a Mizbeach and we could ask a Kohen to shech the Korban and do what's called the Zrika? But we need the critical point to Zorik the Dam, sprinkle the blood on the Mizbeach, and we have the Korban Pesach. Can we do it in the absence of the Beis HaMikdash? So he has an amazing chiddush, certain Gemara in Masechta Megillah. The Gemara tells us about a certain individual. I'll mention his name. His name is Chanyo. Oh, here it is. Now, this fellow Chanyo was in Egypt. And at the time of Chanyo, there was no Beis HaMikdash. The first Mikdash had already been destroyed. And Chanyo got permission from the local authorities in Egypt to set up a house, which is called Beis Chanyo. And in this house, he brought karbanos. Now, the Gemara asks, again, this I didn't give out to you, we can always photocopy, but just to give you the gist of it, the Gemara says, how could he do such a thing? The only way that you could set up a Mizbeach outside of the area of the Mikdash is through something that's called a bama, Bet Mem Hey, which is a private altar. Now the question is, in the absence of the Beis HaMikdash, do I have a right? Is it permissible to set up a personal altar in my own backyard? In this case, Chanyo set up his own house, a structure. Inside the structure, he built an altar and he brought karbanos. So the Gemara asks, how could he do such a thing? So the Gemara answers that Chanyo was of the opinion that Kiddusha Rishona, which is the Kiddusha of the Mikdash that was established by David and mostly by Shlomo when he built the Mikdash, Kidsha l'shaita, v'lo kidsha li'osid. What that means is that the Mikdash has its own sanctity, but that sanctity is dependent upon the existence of the Mikdash. When the walls of the Mikdash stand, it has its sanctity. When the Mikdash is destroyed, it loses its sanctity. Now, you have to understand, before Shlomo built the Beis HaMikdash, we were allowed heter bamos to build our own personal bama. And therefore, once Shlomo built the Beis HaMikdash, we could no longer bring a carbon on a bama, on a private altar. We have to bring it in the Beis HaMikdash. But Chanya was of the opinion that that's only true as long as the Mikdash stands. Once the Mikdash is destroyed, then there's no possibility of bringing a carbon in the Mikdash. Now we go back, the floodgates are open, so to speak. We go back to the situation as it existed before Shlomo Melech built the Beis HaMikdash, and we could bring a carbon on a bama. And then the Gemara goes into a whole long discussion about whether or not the premise of Chanya is correct. The Gemara quotes a dissenting view that Kedusha of Mikdash Kidsha L'Shaita V'Kidsha L'Yasif. That once Shlomo had built the Beis HaMikdash, the sanctity of the Mikdash was eternal. And it doesn't depend upon the four walls that surround the Mikdash. And even after Churban, the Makkah, the place of the Mikdash, is still sanctified. And therefore, Chanyo has no right, according to that view, of taking a bama, taking advantage of a private altar, because Kedusha Rishona Kidsha L'Shaita V'Kidsha L'Yasif. So the Kedushas Mikdash still exists, and therefore Chanyo has no right to set up a bama. Now, how do we paskin? There's a gigantic machlokus between the Rambam and who always argues against the Rambam, if you're familiar, the Ravid. Right? The Rambam holds that Kedushas Mikdash, Kidsha L'Shaita, V'Kidsha L'Yasif, which seems to be the final conclusion of the Gemara. However, the Ravid disagrees, and he accepts the view of Chanyo that Kidsha L'Shaita v'lo Kidsha L'Yasif, which means that with Churban, the sanctity of the Beis HaMikdash is completely undermined, completely neutralized. So Rav Kalisher in his book wants to suggest that maybe we could bring karbanos like the Karban Pesach in our time, because we're going to paskin like the Ravid against the Rambam. And the Ravid holds that we paskin that Kedusha Rishona Kidsha L'Shaita v'lo Kidsha L'Yasif. So that with Churban, the Kedusha Beis HaMikdash is completely undermined, completely neutralized. Hence, we can bring a carbon anywhere we want on a bama. Imagine every single person is going to set up his own bama and bring a carbon Pesach. Sounds like the Shomronim, if you know what I'm talking about. In any event, so that was Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalish's first suggestion. Whoa. He got it over the head for that. And the one who took very strong opposition to him was none other than Rabbi Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, Rabbi Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, who you may know was the first chief rabbi of Palestine. And he wrote extensively to prove that we accept the Rambam Shita against the Ravid, which means that we hold, halacha l'maisa, that Kidsha L'Shaita V'Kidsha L'Yasif. And therefore, there's no room for building a bama. We don't have a heter bama, so we're not permitted to set up our own private altar, because Kidsha L'Shaita V'Kidsha L'Yasif Lavo, and that's how we pass like the Ram. And Rav Kook spends endless amount of pages to try to prove that. We don't accept the Ravid sheet. So Rav Kalisher came back and he said, wait a minute, there's good news. Why is there good news? Because if we accept the Rambam's view that Kidsha L'Shaita V'Kidsha L'Yasif Lavo, that means that even after Churban, the Makom HaMikdash, the place for the Beis HaMikdash, still has sanctity, which means that I cannot set up my own bama, my own personal altar, but what I can do is I can set up a Mizbeach in the Makom HaMikdash. And that's where I'm going to bring the carbon. we don't have a Mikdash. It doesn't matter because we're paskening that Kedusha, Kidsha L'Shaita, V'Kidsha L'Aslo. So even after Churban, after destruction, the place is still sanctified. I'll set up a Mizbeach, and then I'll bring the Korban Pesach. Oh. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But before we get to the question of Tumah, let's just let this sink in. Tosfos in Masechta Megillah quotes Rabbeinu Chaim HaKohen. Rabbi Chaim HaKohen is a very rarely quoted Baal HaTosfos. He has a lot of revolutionary ideas in many different areas of halacha. Here too, it's preaching. Tosfos says, in the name of Rabbi Chaim Cohen, that if I hold, according to the man the Omer, lo kid shel yasud lavo, then we cannot be makriv on the mizbeach, because we cannot be makriv on the mizbeach because the place has no sanctity. And he writes, Rav Chaim Cohen, quoted by Tosfos, li achar achurban pakala kidushas beis hamikdash. So the sanctity of the beis hamikdash is completely gone. And Tosfos says that Kitcha Rishona v'Kitcha Liyasilov, according to that opinion, he says, Mokom HaMizbeach, b'Mokom HaMizbeach li'achar shenechrav muter lahakriv. So it is the following. In light of Reb Chaim Cohen, we come to the conclusion that we can be makriv karbanos in the place where the Mizbeach stood. And the reason for that is because Kedusha Rishona Kitcha L'Shaita V'Kitcha L'Asid. So in other words, this would satisfy the opinion of Rav Kook, because again, as I told you, Rav Kook said, we paskin Kitcha L'Shaita V'Kitcha L'Asid. So we cannot be makriv on a bama in our personal backyard, even though I got a beautiful porch here. It would be a great place here in this hotel to be makriv a korban. But we could be makriv as we set up a mizbeach. So therefore, Rav Kalisher, in his reformulation, he says, okay, we're not going to bring the Korban Pesach in our own personal private altar, but we'll set up an altar, a Mizbeach, exactly where the Mizbeach stood at the time of the Mikdash. And we're holding now that Kitcha L'Shaita, V'Kitcha L'Yasid Lava, which means that the area of the Mikdash was sanctified eternally, even if we don't have the actual physical structure and it was destroyed, but the sanctity is still there. And therefore, we can set up a Mizbeach and bring the Korban Pesach. And in the letter that he wrote to Rabbi Akiva Eiger made 2 points. Point number one is that we're all Tmeim. If the sanctity of the Mikdash still exists, because Kitcha L'Shaita v'Kitcha L'Yasid Lava, we are all Tmei, excellent, we're all Tmei Mason, and therefore we can't go into that place. How can we set up a Mizbeach? So mikvah will work for most tumas. For example, tumas zav. If a person is a zav or a tumas sheretz, he came in contact with a dead lizard of some sort, then in a finami he could jump into mikvah and that would be fine. But the problem is that if he came in contact with a dead body, or for example, he came in contact with someone else who came in contact, or he was in an OLMS, or he went to a funeral, etc., then with regard to tumas mes, we need Efer Para Duma. We need Azoya on the 3rd and the 7th day. So we never be matar ourselves from tumas mes without the Para Duma. So this was the first objection of Rabbi Akiva. The second objection was, we need a Kohen. That's very fascinating because it could be that according to the Ravid and Chanyo that we spoke about before, the Kitcha L'Shaita v'lo Kitcha L'Yasid Lava, which means there might be a heter bama, then it could be we don't Kohen on a bama. I mean, that's a sugya at the end of Zvachim. I mean, you'd have to ask a genius in Kachim about that. But we're not going with that shita. We're going with the shita that Kitcha L'Shaita v'Kitcha L'Yasid Lava, which means that we bring your korban on a mizbeach in a place that's sanctified, in the Beis HaMikdash itself, even though Mikdash is not standing. So here we need a Kohen. Says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, who's willing to say I'm a Kohen? And Rabbi Vega claims that for this you need what's called a kohen miyuchas. Now, a kohen miyuchas means that he can trace his genealogy, father, son, back to someone who served in the Mikdash at the Mizbech.
How does someone claim they're a Kohen to be at a Pidyon HaBen?
Excellent question. So the Vilna Gaon, you should know, just for historical, he used to run around. He was a Bechar, and he used to run around. Whenever he met a Kohen, he would be poda himself to that Kohen. Because maybe I'll find some Kohen, it might be a Miyuchas. But you should know that the Rishonim say that our Kohanim today are what's called Safek Miyuchasim. And Rabbi Kiva gives you a long list. It's like a who's list amongst the Rishonim and Poskim, that every Kohen today is considered a Safek. We don't know if he's Miyuchas or not.
He said he's good enough for Pidyon HaBen, but not good enough for.
I guess, well, he's probably not going to take home, so we'll let him get away with it. Excellent question. So the one who answers your question was the Chassam Sofer. You may know that the Chassam Sofer was a son-in-law of Rabbi Vega, so he was arguing here with his father-in-law. Now, no one should ever try that unless you're a Chassam Sofer. Anyway, next week we have our first yard site from my father-in-law, and the part of Corona. In any event, so what I want to tell you is that the Chassam Sofer, that this whole business, that you find sources in Rishonim and Poskim, that we don't have a Kohen Miyuchas in our day, he says all just a chumrah. It's a super duper strict pious application of an abstract halacha. He says according to halacha, we have what's called a chazaka. Chazaka tells me that unless I know otherwise, I can assume a person has what's called a cheskes kashrus. Every Kohen says some sofer, it's a cheskes kashrus, that he's a Kohen kosher. We have no reason to take a Kohen and suspect that he's not a Kohen kosher. And says the Chassam Sofer, if you're going to object to Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher and his recommendation of bringing carbon today, then find another reason. Don't blame it on the fact that we're Kohen Miyuchas. And here he writes another two problems. He raises two issues. One is big day kahuna. You know that a Kohen, in order to serve and bring a carbon, has to have big day kahuna. Amongst the big day kahuna, you have to know a lot more than we know. You have to know about the avneit and what it was made of. But there are two elements in big day kahuna that we cannot identify today. One is called tcheles, because Rashi says that tcheles in big day kahuna, like the tcheles in tzitzis, have to come from chilazon. We don't have a Masorah on chilazon. And number two, one of the dyes, dye, is called argaman, and we don't know what argaman is. So therefore, the Chassam Sofer raises the problem of big day kahuna. How can we bring a carbon in our time when we don't have the wherewithal of big day kahuna? So the poskim, now you have to understand, a contemporary of Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher was Ellinger. Now, you may not be familiar with the name, the Aruch LaNer. Excellent. The Aruch LaNer wrote a book called the Binyan Sion. And the first four tshuvas of Binyan Sion are all an analysis of this debate between Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher and Rabbi Akiva Eiger and those who opposed to him about bringing karbonos bisman hazeh. And he comes to the conclusion that one or two things are possible. Either we can identify tcheles and argaman, or if not, that's not likuva, and it's not absolutely critical. Now, I would add the following comment to my own listening. Just by show of hands, the men here, how many of you wear tcheles? Or one person? Okay. Now, my Rebbe was Rav Soloveitchik. He was not into tcheles. Yeah, there are plenty of good Jews who wear tcheles. You have no problem. You're in good company. But those who don't wear tcheles, it's probably because we're too conservative. And that has nothing to do with the movement of the conservative movement. I didn't mean that. What I meant by conservative is that We go by our Masorah. We do what our parents did. My Zayda didn't wear tchelis, my father didn't wear tchelis, I'm not going to wear tchelis. Okay, that's a conservative kind of view. Rav Soloveitchik put it in halachic terms, and he said that tchelis requires Masorah. A Masorah means an unbroken tradition. We don't have a Masorah on tchelis. We can try to prove it based on simanim, on indications. We may have indications that convince us 1,000%, although the Redzina Rebbe, who dedicated a lot of his time to tchelis, he came up with a different tchelis. Rav Herzog, who was chief rabbi of Palestine and then the state, he had a different opinion on what tchelis is. So I don't know if Greenspan is the last word on tchelis, but Greenspan has done a tremendous amount of research. What's his partner's name? I forget. He has a sidekick who's also a great scientist. Anyway, so that's a question.
This temple in the old city, there's the Temple Institute that claims they're making the kalim for the Beis Hamikdash.
Right.
Okay. So are they also involved with the tchelis, the begotten for Beis Hamikdash?
I assume so. Yeah, I haven't been there. I don't know.
Everything ready.
They've got everything, but okay. I don't want to make any comments here because whatever I say will be held against me. But I'm not exactly sure what their angle is.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's a mitzvah. They claim there's a mitzvah to create kalim for the mikdash. I didn't find such a mitzvah, but maybe they have a source for it. I don't know. Anyway, it's a beautiful place to visit, I suppose. But so these are the issues that we have to raise over here. The first big day kahuna, and then we have to raise the issue of kohen miyuchas. And the issue of kohen miyuchas was already addressed, as we said before, by the Chassam Sofer. So then, according to Chassam Sofer, we can take that off our list of problems. We have an objection because of big day kahuna. And the Binyan Sion claims, that's Rav Ettlinger, the Aruch LaNer, he claims that we can come up with big day kahuna. It's not an issue. Even if we're not 100% sure, we can certainly be makar of the karban based on big day kahuna. Another issue, however, and this becomes very relevant to my jump because I want to apply all this to the karban minchas Omer, is the issue of shkolim. I don't know how many people are into Daf Yomi. We'll have Daf Yomi Shir here tomorrow. I know we had Daf Yomi the last couple of days. We'll try to continue that tradition. And in shkolim, it says that a karban sibur, right? We have two categories of karbanos. We have private karbanos and public karbanos, so a communal karbanos. Communal karban has to come from the funds of what's called the Trumas Halishka. This is the shkolim that were collected from all members of Klal Yisrael. It's all issue about women, whether women are obligated in shkolim or not. But certainly if a woman would come forward with her shkolim, we would accept them. And then we go and we buy a karban sibur from these funds. And the later poskim, this is already in the 20th century, they say, how could we bring a karban bismanenu if it's a karban sibur? We don't have shkolim. We don't have a collection of shkolim. So I was fascinated because many of the poskim argue that we have a principle in halacha called zachin li adam shelo b'fanav. What that means is that I can take ownership over an object on your behalf if it's positive. Again, if it's a rabid dog, I don't know if that's a good idea, but if it's something that's worth something, and nobody would argue that it's a zchus, it's in your favor and your merit, then I can make a kinyan and I could acquire ownership on your behalf, even if you didn't appoint me as your agent. So therefore, the poskim say that there's no problem with shkolim. What we're going to do is we're going to have someone grab a bunch of shkolim, and he's going to say, I am hereby acquiring ownership on these shkolim on behalf of the entire community of Israel. And then we're going to use those shkolim to buy a karban sibur. Now, the Minchas HaOmer is a classic case of a karban sibur. But if we've solved the problem of shkolim, then we're okay, because we now can purchase a karban sibur from funds that are owned by the tzibur through the principle of zachin li adam shelo b'fanav. Just give me one more minute because I'm going to lose my trend. And here's the punchline. Again, the punchline of it all is meaning. Let's go back to the beginning. Rabbi Kivega said that we have a problem because of Tamei Mason, that we all have been contaminated through a corpse. and therefore you can't go into a Mokum Kadosh. We can't enter the site of the Mikdash when we're in a state of Tumah. So if Tzvi Hirsch Kalisha said to his Rebbe, to Rebbe Kiva Eger, what are you talking about? I want to bring a Karban Tzibur, like, for example, Karban Pesach. Now, again, if we were great geniuses and scholars, we'd have to analyze whether Karban Pesach is really a Karban Tzibur or not. In fact, the greatest proof that it's not a Karban Tzibur is the fact that we don't have to purchase a Karban Pesach from Shkolim. Right? There's no such thing as using the Trumas Halishka to buy Karban Pesach. So that itself is ipso facto a proof that it's not a Karban Tzibur. But in any event, we apply the principle that we override Tumah. If most of the Tzibur are Tmeim, then we will bring a Karban Pesach. In fact, that principle applies not just to Karban Pesach, but to any Karban Tzibur, including the Minchas HaOmer. So if we have a situation in which most of the people of Israel have been contaminated with Tumas Mess, we could bring the Karban even without Tara, without purifying ourselves, simply because of Tumah. Now, again, whether it's Tumah Hutra B'tzibur or Tumah Techuya B'tzibur, that's a whole different issue. But either way, the Rambam happens to paskin that Tumah is the Techuya B'tzibur. So you might ask me, so why should we bring the Minchas HaOmer? I'm going to tell you why I think we should bring the Minchas HaOmer, even if you hold like the Rambam that Tumah is only Techuya B'tzibur. Because we need the Omer to be matir what's called Chadash.
You're losing out if you do that.
What do you say?
The halacha nowadays, before that, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, from sunrise, we can already eat Chadash.
Correct. That's totally in the Omer stuff. That's in the Tzuah Shalom even without the Karban Omer. But I still don't.
If we brought over, you'd have to wait another 6 hours or something.
Right. But I don't think this is relevant. I'll tell you why. Because the very fact that Bisman Shem Mikdash Kayom, when the Mikdash stood, we would bring the Omer in order to be Matir Chadash, right? The Mishnah says in Masechta Menachos, Daf Samach Vav, Samach Ches, wherever it is, it says, Omer Haya Matir Be Medina, V'shtei Alechem Be Mikdash. So the Mishnah is outspoken about the fact that the Omer itself is Matir Chadash. Maybe a difference of 6 hours, whatever it is, but the Mishnah says, you can't deny it, that the Omer is Matir Chadash, that which we couldn't eat from the new crops, we can only eat after the Omer is brought. That itself should be enough of a reason to bring the Omer.
That's what I was saying. The Gemara says that now that there is no Mikdash, so we get from sunrise we can get right. So I'm doing good. I'm doing
right, but I'm going to gain another 12 hours.
Of what?
Of the Heter Omer, because once I do the Ktsira, that itself would. Well, yeah, you're right. I need the Hafah. You're right. I have to wait till daybreak. But in any event, this would be an argument of whether or not we would be overriding Tumah as we do in the case of any Karban Tzibur for the sake of Minchas Omer. But in my mind, the only outstanding issue is Big Day Kahuna. Now, just to conclude this discussion, because I want to use how are we doing on the clock, but we don't have that much time. I want to conclude this discussion by mentioning another letter that Rabbi Kiva Eger sent to Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalisha, to his disciple, and that is the Makom HaMizbeach. There's a pasuk which the Gemara quotes very frequently throughout Shas from Divrei Yomim that indicates that the Mizbeach has to be located in a very exact location. And Rabbi Kiva Eger says that we have different shitos about what the Amma is, right? The Amma is a measurement. So when we measure different areas, west and east and north and south, to figure out exactly where the location of the Mizbeach is, who's going to tell us exactly where the Mizbeach is located? And based on this argument, he comes to the conclusion that we need both a Navi, a prophet in Israel, and Sanhedrin, which is another issue of whether or not we can set up the Sanhedrin in our time, in order to paskin and determine exactly where is the Makom of Mizbeach. And this, as a result of this letter of Rabbi Kiva Eger, an entire literature mushrooms around the question of what is an Amma? Can we know what an Amma is? Now, for those of you who may know, there's a gigantic debate between Reb Chaim Noah and the Chazon Ish, exactly what an Omer is. And the question is, can we establish a tradition, let's say, for example, like Reb Chaim Noah against the Chazon Ish, and decide what the Omer is? And then since we know where the Kodesh Kodashim is, by the way, how do we know where the Kodesh Kodashim is today? Because we have the Evan HaShasiyah. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have it yet, but they have it. But the Evan HaShasiyah is there. So we know exactly where the Avodas Kohen Gadol was on Yom Kippur, on the holiest days. And from that area, we can determine exactly where the Mizbeach is. So there's a whole slew of poskim, and I would say even the majority view that we can figure out today where to put the Mizbeach. And we come to what's called Horas Din. Horas Din means that whenever you have an issue in halacha, we have a mechanism by which we come to some conclusion. We paskin halacha, and we're going to operate within the Horas Din, and we're going to come to a conclusion exactly where to set up the Mizbeach. But the only problem that I have personally, and if I could solve this problem, then I'm wondering if we should. By the way, do we have anyone here who has a little bit of a Belzer background? My wife is a Belzer.
Direct.
So Rabbi Arla Belzer, who my father-in-law, may rest in peace, was very close to Rabbi Arla, he would run away from Yerushalayim during Pesach because he felt that we should be bringing the Korban Pesach in our time. So he wanted to be what's called Berichuk Makom, and therefore he's exempt from the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. I'm just giving you a shakaru why you shouldn't think, sometimes again, I shouldn't say this, so cross it off the official recording, but sometimes we tend to attribute certain Piskei Halacha to politics. Maybe there is a basis for that, but not in this case. This machlokas about whether we should be bringing the Korban Pesach in our time is a pure, unadulterated halachic issue with many different dimensions to it. This has nothing to do with Zionism. I don't care if you're pro-Zionism, if you're anti-Zionism. I don't care what color kippah you wear and what flag you wave. It's irrelevant. This is a halachic issue that spans and crosses all political, territories. So therefore, my issue personally, again, I'm not trying to be prejudice you, but I have questions about Big Day Kahuna. I'm not sure if we can be definite about Big Day Kahuna Bisman Hazeh. And by the way, if a Kohen does the avoda without Big Day Kahuna, he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. That's a pretty severe violation. So I wouldn't want to be the first Kohen to volunteer to wear the Big Day Kahuna and do the avoda, not knowing whether I'm wearing the right book.
I have a simple question. The opinion, what's it, Chonia was his name?
Yeah.
If he is correct, why wasn't it brought, like Rabbi Akiva was after the Churban? How many couple thousand years? Our forefathers didn't bring it. And
So
if
that's not.
that was the right thing, they would have.
So that's not true.
No.
I'm going to shock you again. Here's a real shocker. You know that 5 centuries ago, we had a brilliant fellow by the name, we know him as the Yavitz or Yaakov Emden. Okay, that's a very interesting historical period of time in his relationship with Rav Yonasan Eibishitz. But in any event, Rav Yaakov Emden, not only that, but even the Ratz Chayos, who was a younger contemporary, so we're going back 500 years, he writes that the Gemara in Pesachim tells us that Rabbi Gamliel brought the Korban Pesach. In fact, there are many halachas of Korban Pesach that we derive from Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel actually lived after the Churban, and yet he brought the Korban Pesach. Furthermore, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, the Gemara says, brought a Korban Pesach. He too was after the Churban Habayis. But here's the most radical thing.
Where did they do it?
They did it in the Makom HaMikdash, in the Mizbeach. And I'll tell you something else. This is also way out. One of the Balei HaTosfos, he lived 7 centuries ago in the 1300s. His name is Rabbi Yechiel MiParis. And his Talmud was named Farchi. If you know any Syrians, any Chalabim by the name of Farchi, they no doubt descend from the Kafta of Aferach. That was his magnum opus. So he writes about his Rebbe, Rabbi Yechiel MiParis, that Rabbi Yechiel MiParis had packed his bags to go to Yerushalayim to bring the Korban Pesach in the year 1360. This is after the Churban, I don't have to tell you, right? And he says that he's not sure exactly why at the end of the day Rabbeinu Yechiel didn't actually bring the Korban Pesach. He indicates in his writings, if we had time we go through them inside, that there was a certain tirda. Tirda means that he was preoccupied. Something went wrong. This is not long after the Crusades.
24
truckloads. The truckloads, in Paris. You remember that? We have right. We have the Kina on Tisha B'Av of what's the name of the Kina? Okay, it'll come back to me. Anyway, bottom line is Shali Srufa Beis. Excellent. Shali Srufa Beis. Thank you so much. Shali Srufa Beis. Yeah. Now, the Kafta B'Ferach, and with this I want to conclude because we don't have much time, and I want to add a few other things on a different topic. The Kafta B'Ferach writes that although his Rebbe was on the way to bring the Korban Pesach, he says that I also, just 1 second, I want to read his language to you, if I can find it here, just 1 second. Give me a second, sorry, I apologize. I don't want to misquote him. Oh. He says, as far as Tumas Mes is concerned, he says, Tumas Mes Nidches. He has no problem. That's not his issue. However, he says, you know what bothers my mind? He's not sure about Kohen Miyuchas. Now, watch what's going on here. This is 4 centuries, or 3 and change, before Rebbe Akiva Eiger. And Rav Farchi is already claiming that we might not be able to bring the Korban Pesach because we don't have a Korban Miyuchas. He has no other problem. Meaning that as far as Tumah is concerned, he doesn't see an issue. He doesn't mention a word about Big Day Kona, and I don't think he knew more about Big Day Kona than we do. We probably know more than he did in the modern research. If you don't need a tradition, if you just can prove it with Simon. So I just want to leave you with this food for thought, that it could very well be that we could bring the Korban Omer Bisman Hazeh. My hesitation is Big Day Kahuna, but the Farchi doesn't seem to be bothered at all. Now, if you have, for those of you who may have gotten this page, so we mentioned the issue of someone who skipped a day of the Omer. And here I find something absolutely fascinating, which you'll see here on the page. This is paragraph number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5th paragraph down. And he's quoting a Tosas and Menachos. Pasak bahag ba'al lochas gedolos paskin shem hifsik yom echad v'lo sofar. He missed a day and he didn't count it. Shuv eno sofer. He cannot count any more days. Mishum sheboi be'inon tmimus. We need all 49 days. And Tosas comments v'tema gedolahu v'lo yitachim. Tosas says this is absolutely unacceptable. It's not reasonable. By the way, if I sit down, will you still see me? Okay. Now, the simple interpretation, classic, if you would stop any yeshiva book and ask him, what's this all about? I skipped the day of the Omer. Can I continue counting or not? He will tell you the following. And he's quoting the Sefer Chinuch, also from the Rishonim. Then it all depends. Are there 49 independent mitzvahs and every day is a separate mitzvah? Or is there one mitzvah to count 49 days? You're all familiar with that. That's pretty classic. My Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik said no. He said, Everybody agrees that every day of the Omer is a separate independent day, and every day generates a chiyuv of counting the Omer. And the proof of the pudding, I would add in a footnote, my own add, is that we make a bracha on every day. So why then would the Bahag say that if I missed a day, that's it? If every single day is an independent mitzvah, what's the problem? So if Soloveitchik said the following, that the definition of sphera, of counting, requires continuity. For example, let's say tonight was the fourth day of the Omer. It's not, right? But if I didn't count yesterday as the third day of the Omer, I went from 2 to 4 and I skipped a day, then what do you mean it's the fourth day of the Omer? You never told me, you never counted the third day of the Omer. So B'Ezer Hashem, I found an ancient manuscript that was published of the Sefer Achinuch. And it has certain texts that we don't have in the Sefer Achinuch. And he writes that if a person missed the day of the Omer, he should declare Emesh haya kach v'kach, vayomu kach v'kach. He should count yesterday and then go on to count today. If this be the case, then according to this text and this version of the Sefer Achinuch, it could be possible that everybody agrees that every day is a separate independent mitzvah, but I need what's called in Hebrew hemshechiyut. I need continuity. I can't count tonight if I didn't count yesterday. Comes along the Sefer Achinuch to explain the sheet of Tosfos. Tosfos says, "V'tema v'lo yitachin," that we should be able to continue counting despite the fact that we missed a day. And he says, yeah, you'll count yesterday. Now, I don't know what he would say if I only woke up on the 49th day. Can I count the first 48? I don't know. How far? Can I count 2 days that I missed? I don't know. But certainly if I missed one day, I can count yesterday. So if I were to play checkers and I miss every other day, I could still be on the board because I would say that yesterday was so-and-so, and today was so-and-so. So now we have a whole new machlokas, a whole new perspective on what the debate is all about. Everybody agrees there was never an issue that there are 49 separate independent mitzvahs, but what is the mitzvah? That mitzvah is dependent upon the continuity. So now the question is the following, and with this we'll conclude. If you take a look at the top of your page 1, so to speak, you'll see the following. Tosfos quotes Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam says if you didn't count at night, that's it. You can't count during the day. That's Tosfos in Masechta Megillah. But if you fast forward 2 paragraphs to the 3rd paragraph, Tosfos in Menachos says, "Vehecha deshachach lispar balayla, pasak bal halachas gedolos, shesofer bayom." Okay, then? So Rabbeinu Tam says that we cannot count during the day. We can only count at night. As we said at the outset, if those of you who was with me, that according to Rabbeinu Tam, the mitzvah is to count from the Ktsiras Omer, which could only be at night, not from the Avos Omer. On the other hand, Tosfos says, in the name of the Bahag, that if you forgot to count at night, he counts during the day. Now, something very odd is going on over here. The Bahag says that if I missed a day, i.e. 24 hours, then I cannot continue counting. And yet, the Bahag says that if I missed at night, I can count during the day. Does the Bahag mean to say, like the Rambam, that the mitzvah includes not just the Zman of Ktsiras Omer, but also the Zman of Havas Omer? And Tosfos elsewhere, not in Menachos, quotes the Bahag as saying that he should count without a bracha. Now, I don't understand. Mimonavshach, as we say, no matter how you split the cake. If he holds like Rabbeinu Tam and the mitzvah is to count at night because of Ktsiras Omer, then why would he count during the day? It's meaningless. If, on the other hand, he holds that, like the Rambam Shita, that the mitzvah is both during the time of the Ktsira and during the time of the Avo, which means both night and day, then he should be making a bracha. What's this twilight zone where I'm going to count during the day without a bracha? And I believe we have the answer. Why? Because the Bahag holds, like Rabbeinu Tam, the mitzvahs at night. You cannot count with a bracha during the day. But We need the counting during the day. Because that counting during the day would allow me to count the next day in order to set up my continuity. So if you accept Rav Soloveitchik's chiddush here as insight, that everybody agrees there were 49 separate mitzvahs, but the issue is, can I count today when I skipped yesterday? So that even if it's an independent mitzvah, but the mitzvah is counting, and I can't count it if I didn't continue the counting. But comes along the Bahag, and he says that if I miss counting at night, although as far as the Kiyum mitzvah is concerned, I cannot fulfill my mitzvah during the day, but I will count during the day. And what goal do I achieve by counting during the day? The day itself becomes safur. Safur means it's counted. And then tomorrow, I can count the. Just to conclude with one very quick thought. The idea of the Omer, according to everyone, is to lead up to Kabbalah Sator. The 50th day is the day in which we receive the Torah. Every day we should be achieving a little bit more, climbing, ascending the ladder, and working on the midos. The Bali Kabbalah tell you which midah to work on in each particular day. And ultimately, what we're going to count is the number 49. Now, which is greater, 1 or 49? 49 is great because every day we're adding another day. And I think that what's critical here is that we be proud of ourselves. And how do we get pride in ourselves? By achieving one day after the other and realizing that we're building towards the climax, towards the apex, towards the pinnacle, which is Kabbalah Sator. And that's why I believe the halacha says in Shulchan Aruch you have to count be'amidah when you stand. When a person is proud of their achievements and they want to feel good, what's called in Mishlei Gava Libi B'Darkei Hashem, then they should be standing. So Yiratzon, if His will, that we should all stand, count the Omer, and on every successive night we should feel that continuity as we're building and building to the apex of Kabbalah Sator. At the end of the day. Thank you.
And we're very excited to have our brothers stay for Shabbos and Shvi Pesach. So, meet us downstairs in the shul.
Oh, just put a minute.
Just something here on this thing here.
Yes, sure. It's about the way that there's a group between Haifa and Zichron claims that they have found the Chilazon and so are able to make it.
They claim they found the Chilazon. Is it the same as